Okay, hello and welcome. I'm David Gillam, the festival director, and this is our event, Nature, Violence and the Search for the Disappeared, around this film Valley of Souls. The two people we have on our panel this evening is Berit Bliesemann de Guevara, who's the professor of international politics at Aberystwyth University. Perhaps, Berit, you could just give people away, or you're recognised. I've had the great pleasure of working with Berit off and on over the last few years on the festival, and we've had some good times collaborating on various films and projects. And we also have Andrei Gómez-Suárez, who's co-founder of Embrace Dialogue, who is, I guess, our resident Colombian expert, as he's Colombian. So I'm just going to ask a few questions to them, and then I'll come to the, any questions from the audience. So starting with Andrei, perhaps you could just start and say a little bit about yourself at Embrace Dialogue and the work you do.
Thanks, David, and it's really nice to be here with all of you. And thank you so much also for screening this fantastic film about Colombia. I'm at the moment at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester. I'm a senior research fellow there. I've joined just this January. Before then, I spent 4 years in Colombia between 2014 and 2018, working on the negotiations and the implementation of a peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC. And to do that, I set up an organization with another group of friends of Colombians and friends of Colombia called Embrace Dialogue. You can find us on the internet in the website uk.rodeemoseldialogo.org. I will probably write it down in the chat for you to be able to find it. This organization is a civil society organization created in 2012. And the idea was that we, as civil society, could use our academic expertise and everyday life energies to try to support the negotiations between the government and the FARC. These negotiations were very important for Colombia because we had been at war with the FARC for at least 53 years then. And it was one of those intractable conflicts, and it was very much needed to try to gain support from civil society to move those negotiations forward. So I'm delighted to be here. I've been doing research on Colombia since I came to the UK to do a master's in contemporary war and peace studies, and I did my PhD also here in the United Kingdom at the University of Sussex, researching violence in Colombia. And I'm really, very happy to be able to share some thoughts this evening with you.
Thank you, Andrei. And Berit, do you want to say a little bit about your work in Aberystwyth and the International Politics Department?
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Also, thanks for inviting me here. The reason, I guess, why I'm here today is that I'm a member of a project together with colleagues at the University of Antioquia in Medellin that works with peace signatories or former combatants of the FARC guerrilla group to see how their reincorporation into society is going and how micro processes of reconciliation in the areas where these former fighters now settle are working. So quite often the settlement areas of these former guerrillas is where actually most of the violent conflict also happens. So in those rural areas, those quite remote areas, sometimes like we've also seen in the film. So it's quite interesting to be able to finally speak to people and to see what their motivations were for joining the struggle, but also how they re-narrate themselves and their lives and their relationship to others in society in this peace process. And I think what Andrei just said about the necessity of support from civil society, that's a really important point, because our project started with the observation that especially in the rural areas where most of the kind of financially strong people, but also some very poor people live, there's not much well, among some people, there's not much support for the peace process, and to really get some of those voices from the rural areas into into the conversation, I think is very important. So what we've been doing with our participants in 2 regions of Antioquia is we did narrative interviews with them, but we also invited them to do some needlework with us, some embroidery, to ask them to embroider their preferred stories so that we could actually take them to other people in other parts of the country and also internationally. We just had an international virtual exhibition on the internet. I might also just post the link to that in the chat so you can have a look.
Thank you, Berit. So I'm going to come back to you, Andrei. I mean, you know, I think for all those of us who've seen the film, it's an immensely powerful film and a kind of nightmare, I guess, for any father, you know, this story. But, you know, it was set some time ago. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about that period in which the film was set and then later how that differs now.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, I guess a quick history of Colombia's war is needed here. I mean, as I said, the armed conflict with the FARC started in 1964. And in the 1980s, a peace process between the Colombian government and the FARC started. But at the same time, the FARC had the 7th conference, as they call it. In that 7th conference, the FARC took a decision, and it was that they were going to take over power within the next 8 years. In the middle of the peace process, the government, some sectors of the government and some sectors of the military in Colombia started to use the tactics of counterinsurgency that were used in Central America to create paramilitary groups to fight back against the FARC. This was a very difficult moment for Colombian history. In 1985, these groups started to spread across the center of the Magdalena Valley in Colombia, and they took hold of these regions, in particular a town called Puerto Boyacá in the Magdalena River, quite near to Puerto Berrío. That is the place that is portrayed in the film. These groups were spread until the 1990s under the leadership of different drug barons too, that became very important towards the late 1980s in these groups, in particular Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha and Fidel Castaño. The first one was killed in 1989. The second one, when he saw that all the power of the government was getting behind him, decided to dismantle his group and try to negotiate a way back into society. But in the 1990s, the FARC and the government had gone back to fight a complete war. The peace process between the government and the FARC had fallen apart in the 1987. And a new group of paramilitary groups started to emerge around 1991, and between 1991 and 1994. And in particular in 94, after the government gunned down Pablo Escobar, because Pablo Escobar was seen as an enemy that brought together many of these drug lords around the things that they were doing. So this new group was led by the brother of Fidel Castaño. His name was Carlos Castaño. And this group was called the Self-Defense Forces of Córdoba and Urabá. And this group started branching out and created very strong blocks of paramilitary groups in some of the regions of Colombia. And by 1997, they have managed to create an umbrella paramilitary organization that covered most of the country. This paramilitary organization was called the Self-United Forces of Colombia, AUC. And these forces carried out the most horrendous crimes between 1998 and 2006, when they finally, when one sector of them negotiated with the government. So what we see in this film is one of those towns that was targeted and controlled by paramilitary violence, in which the Colombian government turned the blind eye, to say the least, to what was happening there, and in which many of the army officers in Colombia were colluding with some of these paramilitary groups in those specific regions that were paramilitary strongholds. So this story that you are seeing here probably took place at some point between 2002 and 2005. And Puerto Berrío was a very famous town for the awfulness of what happened, in particular because the river in that part of the course of the river, there was like a geographical curve that made that most of the bodies of people who were disappeared upstream the river were coming in that particular part and being thrown into the shore of the river. And the people in that town started taking the bodies and trying to bury them and to adopt them. But that's a different story that probably we can discuss later. But I think I will leave it like that in trying to put the historical moment in which that happened.
Yeah, thank you, Andrei. But it would also be good to bring us up to date, just what's happening now, perhaps. So, you know, maybe not the whole story from then to now, but just what the situation is now, because for those of us only looking occasionally, there appears to be a peace deal, then the peace deal isn't signed, and then, you know, so for those of us who are not deeply embedded in it, it kind of is still quite confusing what's happening.
Of course. So as I said, the paramilitary groups and the government had some negotiations in 2003, between 2003 and 2006. 40% of the paramilitary groups disarmed and reincorporated into society with a sort of transitional justice mechanism without transition, because the war continued. 60% of them remain in arms, but the government wanted to portray them as criminal groups. So in Colombia, the conflict continued between the Colombian state, the FARC, and another insurgency called the ELN, and some of these groups post the mobilization of paramilitary groups. The FARC was a very strong insurgency. The FARC got to the point that had more than 20,000 foot soldiers. The FARC was about to take over Bogota. It was very near to take over Bogota in 2002. But between 2006 and 2010, the presidency of Álvaro Uribe managed to weaken the FARC militarily, carrying out awful practices like extrajudicial killings, something that has been unveiled recently in Colombia. More than 6,400 extrajudicial killings were carried out by the army, taking innocent people and dressing them up as if they were insurgents to try to show to Colombian society that they were winning the war. So by 2010, Colombia had more than 6 million victims of this armed conflict. And a new government came into power in 2010. And this government, the government of President Juan Manuel Santos, decided that even though the FARC had been weakened, that they were probably around 10,000 foot soldiers at that point, that the only way to move forward was to do a political negotiation with the FARC. So President Santos started a negotiation with the FARC in 2012, and that negotiation went between 2012 and 2016. By the end of 2016, President Santos and the FARC reached a peace agreement, 297 pages peace agreement on 6 points. First point, a rural reform. Second point, a reform of the political electoral system in Colombia. Third point, the reincorporation of the FARC into civilian life. 4 point, this solution to the problem of illicit drugs, in particular the cocaine market in Colombia. 5th, the rights of the victims. And 6th, the implementation of the peace agreement. They put this peace agreement to a referendum, and in the referendum, it was rejected by Colombians by 0.2%. It was the same year of Brexit in the United Kingdom, and fake news managed to convince a sector of Colombian society that they needed to reject the peace agreement. So a renegotiation of the peace agreement started between the government and the FARC, and within a month, they managed to come to a second agreement And that second agreement was approved by Congress. And in 2017, implementation of that peace agreement started. The most important thing, and with this I wrap up, is to tell you that the implementation of the peace agreement was something that was carried out between 2017 and 2018 by President Juan Manuel Santos. But unfortunately, in 2018, a new government came into power in Colombia, and that government came into power with campaigning against the peace agreement. So it had been the group of politicians who had promoted the no in the peace referendum, and they are in government now until 2022. And they have been dismantling and trying to put obstacles for the implementation of the peace agreement. One of the most important elements of the implementation of the peace agreement that is related to this film that we watched yesterday on these days is the creation of a unit that is a unit for the search of the disappeared persons. This unit is a humanitarian unit that has a responsibility that is very important, that is to search for the bodies of the people who have been disappeared in Colombia in the last 50 years. And they have 20 years to fulfill the mandate. So I finish by saying this: the responsibility of this unit is so important that Colombians still don't understand, and is that we have more than, as far as we know, we have more than 100,000 disappeared people in Colombia. This is 3 times the number of disappeared that Argentina had during the dictatorship.
Well, I would like to say thank you, Andrei, but these figures are so staggering that it's, it's all a bit much for us. But Berit, you've been working in Colombia the last few years and with some ex-combatants, and in certain situations where, as you sort of touched on in your introduction, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about the context of your work and how, the process of reconciliation and the issues around the disappeared, and how those kind of mesh together a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the two regions where we are working in Tabeba and Mutata in the Antioquia department, there we work with former combatants. So one group that was a fighting unit, the Front 58, who have stayed together after the peace agreement and built their own village in an area that was already a small hamlet was there of people who suffered very much during the war as well. So they created a whole new kind of village. And the other area where we worked in Llano Grande is one of these state designated reincorporation areas. So basically kind of camp-like installments that were built specifically for former combatants to reintegrate into civilian life. Now, these have had different types of problems. I mean, specifically those state-led reintegration areas are quite often, the land, for example, doesn't belong to people. So it's not quite clear where they're going socioeconomically in the future once kind of the support from the government ends. And with this government, you can be sure that the support for reintegration will end at some point. Nonetheless, it's quite I think it gives hope when you talk to people, nonetheless, that despite all the problems that there are, specifically the local communities, who are those communities that suffered so much during the war, are quite often those who say, well, it is actually really, really good when you live this peace process every day and you are on the ground here. It is actually much better than what we had before, and it's working. And so there's a lot of positive noise from the people who now live with these ex-combatants. Nonetheless, I mean, in the other place where we do our field work, so where this former fighting unit has built their own village, and where generally, so the land belongs to them, socioeconomically, they're much better placed because they have projects like fish tanks, for example, and they sell the fish and it's working quite well. But we could also see there already how violence is continuing also after the peace agreement. So in that area where they settled, new people arrived now in the last year during the pandemic, 150 people from another of these state reincorporation points in another part of Antioquia. So this is in the western part, and these people came from the northern part. because there were so many threats and killings of former combatants in that area that they are basically internally displaced and came to this area where we did our field work to settle and start there anew. So since the signing of the peace agreement in December 2016, so in those few years since then, over 260 probably now. So last time I looked it up, it was 255 former combatants have already been killed. And what is even more staggering is the killings of social leaders, indigenous leaders, peasant leaders, and so on in rural areas, quite often in these areas where still paramilitary groups are active and where drug cartels are active and so on. So way over 1,000 people been killed since then already. So sometimes when you hear colleagues talking about our current pandemic, they say, well, the real pandemic in Colombia is a different one. And it's this violence that's still continuing. So also in the area where we work, there are still paramilitary groups there. They've come to these villages where we work. They've tried to recruit people because the people who were formerly in the FARC have the competence to use arms and are quite sought after. And yeah, so I mean, the peace agreement hasn't ended all the fighting, it hasn't ended all the violence, and sometimes this violence has just transformed. And though people say it's much better now, there were also 3 people already being killed of kind of relatives of the people we've been working with in that short time that we've been working there, which is since late 2017, so not a very long time. Yeah.
Okay, so just before we go to the floor, so kind of prepare your questions. But Andrei, I mean, there's a thing that seems to be going on here about that Berit's talking about, that on the ground in those villages, people think, well, this is better, and it's a process that's kind of working here, despite its flaws and the things that are going on. Whereas you seem to be saying that, but you know, at a kind of national level, at a governmental level, and with this, perhaps this unit for this bid, that you know, in a sense, things are being put in the way of that process. I wonder if you could just sort of talk about a bit about that, because there always does seem to be in the kind of peace building and reconciliation processes, very often this kind of tension between, in a sense, you know, the attempt to get the combatants and so on reintegrated into society, and the victims or the relatives of the victims of the violence who are, you know, still can't move on because of the disappeared, their loved ones have disappeared, and that you know, there's a sort of process there which can very easily be derailed, I suppose, by you know, people who don't really want that process to continue. So if you just talk a little bit about, you know, how that kind of tension plays out.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, David. I wasn't sure whether I was going to answer that, but yeah, I mean, I think let me say the following is reconciliation processes and peace building are not straightforward processes. They are very difficult. The first thing that I will have to say is that the unit that I was talking about, the unit that does the search of the disappeared persons, it is a unit that is now part of the Colombian state. But actually, I was reading an interview with the director of the unit, and she was complaining that they haven't received any support from the government. Actually, the government and Senate withdrew 40% of the budget of the unit last financial year. And this is because, of course, now we have a complex state in Colombia. The traditional state that is used to, you know, that is being part of the institutional structure that was created in 1991 with the Colombian Constitution that transformed the Colombian state. But we have a transitional state, some transitional institutions built up within the state. These are the unit of the search of the disappeared people, the special jurisdiction for peace, that is a peace tribunal in Colombia that would prosecute the most responsible one of the international crimes that took place in Colombia, including the army, the FARC, and third parties who decide to come before the tribunal. We have a Truth Commission that is at this very moment collecting testimonies of the victims, not only in Colombia, but in 23 countries to write a final report that tells Colombians what happens with this violence. And they have been working with communities, with some of the communities that even Berit is talking about. So it is difficult to understand Colombia because we have this transitional state put inside an old state structure. And there is a tension within the same state. One part of the state trying to dismantle that and weaken the work of this transitional state, and this transitional state trying to fight back and say, we have the support of civil society, and we're going to try to transform this country despite of the power of the traditional state. And so what we have in this moment is we are in a liminal phase. And that's what transitions are. You know, transitions could bring a new beginning. Well, no, I don't know if a new beginning, but could bring a better future for many people. But transitions could also bring awful disasters. That was the case of Rwanda. Let's remember what happened in Rwanda. In Rwanda, the genocide was something that happened after a peace negotiation and a peace agreement that came out in 1994. And the genocide happened soon after. So in the case of Colombia, we haven't won anything. We have a peace agreement. The peace agreement is being implemented, but there are strong pressures within Colombian society to try not to move forward. And what is going to happen with that? I think all of this is at stake now in Colombia, because as Berit was saying, we have the increase. Colombia had the year with the less number of human rights violations in 2016, between 2016 and 2014. But ever since then, the numbers of killings and threats against the life of people have been increasing and increasing and increasing. And what professors are saying today in Colombia, like Professor Francisco Gutiérrez and others, is that we are starting a new cycle of violence in Colombia. And that cycle of violence in Colombia could be much more bloody than the one that we've seen so far. And sadly, in Colombia, this is what we have seen throughout history. A peace negotiation in the 1980s opened a new cycle of violence in which an incredible number of killings and tortures and death threats occur. And then in the 1990s, peace negotiations opened a new cycle of violence. And then in the 2000s, negotiations with the paramilitaries opened a new cycle of violence. And now the question is this just the opening of a new cycle of violence? It's very difficult to tell, but that's what is at stake in Colombia at the moment.
Big stakes. So it's a sobering thought, shall we say. So has anybody, I was going to go to the floor audience at this point, has anybody like to put their hand up and ask a question about any of this, or indeed about what they saw in the film and so on, how that relates to this conversation? You can either use, you can just wave with your hand, or those of you who are familiar with the kind of reaction system in Zoom, you can put your hand up. So I can see Glenn Storhog in the gloom. Going to Rowan. Yeah.
Yeah, in the gloom. Sorry, shall I put a light on? A bit of light.
Yeah.
I just point out that there is a question from Constanza in the chat.
Yeah.
List there. And forgive me if this is not a particularly relevant question, but just about external military or financial support from outside Colombia in the whole history of the paramilitary episodes and so on, with armaments, the supply of armaments from outside Colombia. How relevant is that? Or just a question about military provisions.
Do I can see you nodding, Andrei. Do you want to take that question?
Well, I don't wanna monopolize this conversation. So Berit, if you feel you wanna come in, please. I mean, I think I'm gonna answer that question and the other one that I think is important. So the first one says, I'm not sure if I understand well. In this Colombian transition period, Colombia counts with the unit, the HEP, and the Truth Commission? Yes. Colombia, so simple question to that is, Colombia today has the most comprehensive transitional system in the world. There is no other country that has created such a comprehensive transitional system. If you think about South Africa had a truth commission. If you think about Rwanda, there was a tribunal, an international tribunal, and there were some gacaca courts in the country, but they were not linked as part of a peace agreement. In the case of Colombia, they tried to compile, as usual, this is very typical of Colombia, I have to say, but they tried to compile all what the best practices of the world were until 2016 and put something that could not be done better by anyone else, even though we would probably fail in the attempt. So they actually put together the right to truth of the victims by putting a truth commission, the right to justice of the victims by putting the peace tribunal, the right to reparations to the victims by putting the unit of the search of the disappeared persons, and on top of that, the right of guarantees of non-repetition. And that's linking these structures to a previous structure that had been created by the Justice and Peace, by the Victims and Land Restitution Law in 2011 that created a system of reparations for the victims and to ensure non-repetition. So all of these institutions are working at the same time, at the very same time in Colombia. And this is very difficult to understand. And they have to work, the three institutions, the unit, the HEP, and the Truth Commission have to work together, but they have to respect each other's mandate. For example, the Truth Commission cannot share the testimonies with the Peace Tribunal because the Truth Commission is a non-judicial institution. So they have to keep that to themselves. And the judicial institution can actually transfer the testimonies that they collect to the Truth Commission for the writing of the report. The Truth Commission will have to publish the report this year, in November this year. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the tribunal, has 20 years to do the work, and the same the unit of the search of the disappeared people. And the unit, because it's a humanitarian unit, cannot share the information that they get to collect the bodies of the people to the Peace Tribunal, because the Peace Tribunal is actually is a tribunal, and they can blame responsibility when people transfer information. So it's very complex, but yes, that's what's Colombia doing in this very moment. In terms of the other question, the US played a really important role in Colombia throughout the armed conflict, as you might guess. I mean, in Colombia, we have a saying that is so far away from God and so near to the US. That's what many people say. The US was a very difficult, was an ally of the Colombian administration, has been throughout time. There was a plan called Plan Colombia, created in 1999. That plan allowed to reform the military in Colombia, and that plan turned a blind eye to the wrongdoings of the military with paramilitary groups. And then, you know, many people can see how the interaction between both governments and militaries have contributed to the sort of anti-communist violence that has taken place in Colombia over the years. That said, I would just summarize this by saying, or wrap up this by saying, under the Obama administration, there was a transformation, and the Obama administration was very supportive of the peace negotiations with the FARC. And many analysts and academics, and me included, think that this peace process with the FARC would have not been possible if Obama had not supported this during those years. So the arrival of Trump was a disaster for the implementation of the peace agreement. Another arrival of Biden is a light of hope that probably Colombia can sort of go back into implementing the peace agreement.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that quickly, if I can. I mean, obviously not as important as the US, but also important at the moment are drug cartels from Mexico in some parts of Colombia. So there's another film called Sanctorum. If you haven't watched it, I watched it yesterday. If you haven't done it yet, please do. It's directly related to the topic of this film, and it brings you to nowadays Mexico. I just looked up, before we started this conversation, I looked up the figures of disappeared people in Mexico, and there were figures from September 2020, so a few months ago, of over 77,000 disappeared people in Mexico, most of it due to organized crime, with 2019 being the most violent year in that sense since 1964, with over 8,000 cases in that one year, 2019. So there's a lot going on there, and that's what the film also addresses very impressively, I think. So yeah, the other thing I looked into, I tried to find out what the picture of disappearances in the world is, to put kind of Colombia into perspective, but I don't think anyone has actually counted everybody who's disappeared. So the 30th of August is the the UN International Day, or no, what's this called now exactly? It's the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances. Basically, the only thing the UN website says, it's hundreds of thousands of people who have disappeared in at least 85 countries around the world. So it's a massive problem that spans the whole globe, unfortunately. And obviously, I mean, they're the victims themselves. So people who either in kind of military, by the hands of military dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, or in violent conflict as a kind of statement by armed groups, are being disappeared. Quite often they are tortured as well. And then their bodies are just lost. And obviously, I mean, people lose their lives, but then there are relatives all over the world searching. And I think what Andrei said is quite important here. Although some states have actual bodies and commissions to look into these things, it doesn't mean that these cases will be resolved and that these people will find out where their relatives are. So if you think about Chile, for example, where the military coup happened in 1973, and Chile went back to democracy in 1989, I think, or 1990. Now, almost 50 years after that coup, there are still people looking for the remains of their relatives who were disappeared. Although there have been, I think, two truth commissions and a return to democracy. So there is impunity. There is lots of interest that Andrei also mentioned by certain groups in society who are not particularly interested in looking into the crimes during violent conflict or during a dictatorship, respectively. So there's a lot going on there. I think what is interesting is also that because the traditional states are not necessarily interested, or the people who were part of these human rights violations are not particularly interested in finding the truth. Quite often it's civil society movements, organizations, and so on who do the search. So there have been people, for example, in Mexico doing citizen-led forensics, right? So citizens coming together and trying to build up a DNA database and trying to kind of do the work that the police should be doing. There are lots of arts projects to make people aware of the disappearances, which quite often happen in certain parts of the country, while maybe in the capital you don't know about it, or you read about it sometimes in the media, but don't quite know what's going on. So there are these art projects to really make people aware. In Mexico, there's a project where an artist collects the shoes of people searching for their disappeared relatives and engraves the story of that search and of that person into the shoe soles, and then kind of prints it on paper, called The Footsteps of the Disappeared project, to make people aware. Others embroider handkerchiefs, so every story of every disappearance on a new handkerchief, and put them in public spaces to make people aware of that. And they can't keep up with the number of disappeared people. There's still people looking for their relatives in Chile. There are solidarity groups in London, for example, who do embroidery protest every year on 11th of September, which is not just a 9/11 attack that we know, but also the day of the military coup in Chile in 1973, asking for that right to know where the remains are. And I think this is quite strong in the film, in this film as well, that this kind of that closure that is taken away from people is another form of violence on the relatives, really.
Indeed, yeah. Rowan, do you want to pick?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one is from, or the next one rather, is from Simon. Is Mrs. Munoz a real person?
I can't answer that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will come on to the next question then from Malcolm.
Hold on a sec. Andrei seemed to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a film that is based on real facts, and you know, even though obviously her name is not that, but that's what is absolutely famous of what people did in Puerto Berrío as a way of resistance. And I think what is really important to tell is that this was a form of resistance because the order of the paramilitary groups was that anyone who took bodies out of the water would get killed, so that they could not take the bodies out of the water. And what Mrs. Muñoz did in the film was the biggest act of resistance, was taking the remnants of the bodies, bringing it to a cemetery and documenting part by part and keeping a notebook. So yeah, that's not fiction.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question in the chat, actually, Malcolm asked this question. Hi, are the politics of the FARC now represented by a party that people can vote for?
Well, the short answer, you can give the longer answer, Andrei. The short answer is yes. It's also called FARC. And it has the symbol of the FARC red rose, and people can vote for it, but not many people do. And now you can give the background story to that, Andrei.
I was gonna say that was your sort of question, but no, just simply the FARC has now point 3 of the peace agreement was that the FARC was gonna hand over their weapons and they would become a legal party. In 2016, once they hand over the weapons, they have a first Congress, and the name that they chose in the first Congress was the Revolutionary Alternative Force of the Commune, but they kept the acronym. Many people thought that was a bad idea because the name FARC had the stigma of being a narco-terrorist group, and because of that, all the money that was sent to Colombia from the US could not be used because the FARC are still seen as a narco-terrorist organization. So, but today they have changed their name at the beginning of the year, and they have called themselves Comunes, and they have 10 seats in Congress. So they did a bit of what you could think a bit like a very weak power sharing agreement. That was that for 8 years, 2 times in Congress, because in Colombia, the congressional seats last only for 4 years. So the agreement says that for 8 years, they will have 10 seats in Congress, regardless of the votes that they get from them, and that they, after those 8 years, they won't have, only if they win in political campaigning, they will have access to politics.
Thank you. I think I saw Marion, you might have had your hand raised. I'll just pop you on spotlight, Marion, and unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
Right. Well, I'm not really here as an academic, but I'm here as somebody who watched the film with the experience in my own life of having had a sister who, in this country, in the UK, who disappeared in 1973, and we didn't find out what happened to her until 1994, and she was part of a high-profile crime in this country, and she was labelled as a West victim. She was a victim of Frederick and Rosemary West, the couple who abducted, raped and murdered at least 12 women, including two of their children. And it's a crime that has an ongoing legacy, particularly in the media, who exploit it. And in fact, I've only just had yet another email informing me that there's going to be another film about this crime showing next week. So this is 26 years since we found out what happened. And I wrote a book which I called If You Sit Very Still. And it's about my engagement. It says a sister's fierce engagement with traumatic loss. But in that, and I just felt my own academic discipline and my sister Lucy's academic discipline was English literature. So the year that she was murdered, we were both in our final year of studying English at 2 different universities, and it felt really important to find some words and express this in some way, and to reclaim her from her labels as missing person and West victim. And this process actually took a very long time, but it began with a piece of writing that was published in the Guardian weekend in 1996 that I called Salvaging the Sacred. And I have a great interest in healing because my work has been as a homeopath. So I spend a lot of time listening to other people and trying to identify what needs to be healed in their lives. And the publishing of that article or essay led to quite a big response, because in it I described the importance for me of relating physically and spiritually with the remains of my sister, which were actually labelled as an exhibit for the defence for another year after the crimes were literally unearthed. And so for me, dreams were very important. And the first dream I had in 1973 was shortly after she disappeared. And in the dream, she came back and I said, "Where have you been?" And she said, "I've been sitting in a water meadow." And then she said the words, "If you sit very still, you can hear the sun move." And the effect of those dreams, she was a poet. She did have a great facility with words. The effect of that dream on me in the dream and waking up from it was a kind of sense of this profound peace that passeth understanding, if you like. That's what came to me. I mean, Lucy had chosen to become a Catholic at university. We didn't have a religious upbringing, but eventually my spiritual path led to me choosing to become a Quaker because I was particularly interested in peace process. And that was just before we found out what happened to her. I also started going on 7-day silent Buddhist retreats, which was a real opportunity for self-confrontation and to actually have to ask myself some very deep questions and to actually to allow the thaw in me of what I call the unresolved pain. And I had a sense that there were 4 routes that this could take. And one was further violent, would be to dump it on others. And the end result of that would be murder. One would be to let it eat me away. The end result of that could be suicide. One was to try and deny it. And the only creative, imaginative way forward that came to me on this retreat was to work towards forgiveness. But I didn't really know what that could mean and how it could be, but it just seemed the only way out. And so the journey from that moment was to attempt to explore that, what it could mean, how it could be. And I was given a grant from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust to allow me to have the space just to make this journey. And it took 7 years of going on retreats and being with the pain and carrying on as a mother of 3 teenage children. But it felt like I really knew that it was really important not to leave a legacy of bitterness and hatred. It felt like the challenge for me was how to be able to live with the reality of what had happened, how to face it, accept it, but also to find a way forward that meant I wasn't corrupted and destroyed by this, but that I was able to be fully alive and and to be able to use this experience in a way that could help others somehow. And so I think writing the book and sharing that was published in 2012, meant that that again took me into further conversations. And I spent 3 months on Vancouver Island in the Department of Religion and at the University of Victoria, as what was called a community sabbaticant. So I was taking the book, the story, into a new culture, and particularly connected with the over 1,500 disappeared Indigenous women. And I wanted to find out more about how do Indigenous people approach the healing of traumatic loss. And so this is a very, and I found the film incredibly moving, as you can imagine. And the second dream I had actually led me to go and wrap my sister's bones shortly after we found out what had happened. And so the importance of that was profound. It was really necessary to directly connect with what was left and to honor them and reclaim them from what had happened. And I shared that in this piece of writing. What struck me in the film was these words that I wrote down. I paused it and wrote it down, which was about the appeal to San Antonio and the 3 virtues: the remembering what is forgotten, finding what is lost, and bringing closer what is distant. And that just resonated so deeply for me. But I was also very moved by the amount of the film that was in darkness, physically in the dark. And, you know, I started watching it and I thought, oh, do I need to draw the curtains? You know, I could hardly see anything, this paddling boat in the dark river. But the whole kind of metaphor of it was extremely powerful. And so just from, I'm sorry, I've only strangely started to connect with the disappeared in Central America and South America, but I have worked with something, this journey, the inner journey, where I did find compassion for the people who murdered my sister, then led on to working in prisons for 15 years with something called the Forgiveness Project, which you might be interested in looking into, which is a collection of stories from people who've suffered traumatic loss or perpetrated it. So it's looking at, for me, this work is about taking the labels off, not calling people victims or perpetrators, but bringing people into contact, into dialogue. I just wonder how much of the reconciliation work that you've described, Berit, it is, you know, you've talked about embroidery and arts, but, you know, this issue about how do you actually live, how do you integrate perpetrators and victims, how do you create a future where people can find an authentic position in this, which somehow has to embrace the fact that many people will not find the bodies of those who've disappeared. You know, they're and especially the situation in Chile, which I have been reading about, you know, the terrible reality that many of those bodies were dumped in the sea, will never be found again. And, you know, in the case of my sister, her body was dismembered. And I felt like, for me, you know, there's something about, on a spiritual level, what has been dismembered needs to be remembered. How do you, you know, remember something in a way that can bring a sense of healing into the process? And you know, apart from all the political terribleness of it and the huge numbers involved, I just wonder how much, and I'm not talking about Christian forgiveness, I'm talking about actually finding a way of being somehow transformed by this experience so that you're able to live with compassion and wisdom, and how can you help the people? How are you helping the people labelled as victims to make a healing journey apart from the terrible oppression of the political situation, which is absolutely trying to not let that happen? I just wonder, sorry, I've talked for far too long.
No, thank you so much. I mean, it's so great to hear from your experience about this, really. And I think there's so many so important themes that you've mentioned. I think there is a reason why so many people really kind of somehow creatively engage with these topics, because it's the journey of searching doesn't end, and it becomes part of people's lives. So I think it's really important. And I think what you also said, quite often this work around disappeared people that relatives do is not just kind of the important search for the remains, but it's also to humanizing that person again. So it's not just a disappeared person, it's somebody, it's my daughter, or it's my sister, or it's my mother, for example.
That's why I wrote the first piece. It was very much about reclaiming this from labels, but in prisons, the work is about taking the labels off as well. You know, how do we connect? How do you sit with someone who's raped and murdered someone? And we do it through sharing stories. So I will share something of my story. We have a so-called perpetrator sharing a story, and then we encourage the people who are involved in the workshops, which take 3 to 4 days, then begin to tell their stories. And it's the power of the story that somehow helps people to find words or expressions. You know, how do you express this pain? How do you change? I talk about the journey being from a frozen silence where there aren't any words to a shining silence where something has been resolved and there's no need for words. But it's this process of thaw, this process of being human. Yes, it's something about, you know, rehumanizing my sister then led to the realization that the people who murdered her in such a terrible way also need to be rehumanized. And so when there's yet another film coming out next week talking about Rosemary West, the woman in the situation, the making of a monster, you know, that's the title. You know, you've got this tabloid mentality carrying on, poisoning the national psyche yet again. You know, how do we raise the register around this?
Yeah, and I think this is what our project also does. Like the question we asked when we invited people to embroider was, what story do you want to tell other Colombians about yourself? And people told all sorts of stories of trust building after the peace agreement, but also stories of their family before they joined the guerrilla, for example, and why it was that they joined the guerrilla in the first place. Quite often stories of physical or structural violence already that drove them to become part of it, and so on. So there's a lot to be unpacked, I think, on both what is labeled the victim and the perpetrator, and a lot to be humanized. And the other thing that you said about the healing and the forgiveness, I think there are these small acts that we actually observed in our project. For example, the place where this reincorporation zone was established in one of the localities where we were, or where we do our field work, was kind of the land was given by a woman who lost her husband at the hand of guerrilla, but who said, well, somehow we have to move on and I have to do something here. So there are these small acts sometimes, not everybody, obviously. And I think the kind of the mechanisms that Andrei talked about also keep some people from speaking a bit more freely about what happened, because there is still the kind of transitional justice mechanisms and also the kind of the tribunal one, which has actual effects. so that not everybody talks about everything they've done, but I think there is some willingness among some people. And these are these kind of small acts I was talking about that happen in the kind of very local setting between people who somehow have to live on and live together. Doesn't mean it's everybody, but I think it's quite visible. I don't know, Andrei, if you have any from your work of embracing dialogue, any examples.
No, listening to Marianne, it makes me think that one of the most important driving sources of reconciliation are precisely people who have gone through this incredible path of forgiveness and finding compassion after so much suffering. It reminded me of the book of Desmond Tutu, There Is No Future Without Forgiveness. But it's a tough path, We see it in Colombia, people who have gone through this similar experience, taking two completely different paths. One, the path, as Marianne was saying, one taking the path of forgiveness and compassion and resignifying their lives, and the other people full of anger and hatred and seeking revenge. And so the transition is very complex because not everyone finds that path of forgiveness and compassion. And some people need time. Some people, so in the case of Colombia, many people justify the impossibility of forgiveness because they feel that impunity is still there. So they say, yes, I want to forgive, but I want the wrongdoers to acknowledge responsibility. I want the wrongdoer to tell me why they did it, who gave the order in the case of Colombia, because also this is the sad part of a country like Colombia. Imagine 6,400 people who were killed by the institution who was meant to protect them. Yes. And it's not like one policeman doing this. I mean, this is systematic. It's a state who has betrayed its own people and is not fulfilling the duty of caring about them, and is killing children as young as 14 years old who had brain damage, and taking them from their houses, killing them, flying their bodies to a completely different region, dressing them up as guerrilla fighters, and then bringing them to the media and say, look, we kill another insurgent. And then her mom trying to find out who had given the order of this, and discovering that her son could not have been a member of a guerrilla group when he had brain damage. So this is the complexity of the situation in Colombia. And this demands structural reforms. So there are strong groups of victims who are saying, no, we are not willing to forgive. No, in this moment. In this moment, forget it about it. I mean, we will forgive the day that we see a state that has acknowledged responsibility for this, and the day that commanders of the FARC who kidnap people and there was sexual violence in the middle of those kidnappings take responsibility and say that what they did was absolutely wrong. Before that, there is no forgiveness. So it's absolutely difficult. You think about the work that the unit of the search of the disappeared people is doing, and this is beautiful because it goes alongside of what you were saying, Marianne, and what Berit was saying. What they have been doing is that they have acknowledged officially 500 people who have been searchers of disappeared people. Who are these 500 people? Relatives of the people who were disappeared, who started to search for their bodies. And they were doing that for 25 years without support of the Colombian state, with their own hands, with their own money, knocking from door to door, just like we saw it in the film. So the unit is not only trying to say, oh, I'm the unit of the search of the disappeared people, and here I am, but it's how do I work with the victims organizations, with the relatives who have organized themselves and been doing this for more than 25 years in Colombia. And we acknowledge all the incredible amount of work that they have already done to try to find the bodies of the relative people. So that's the reason why this unit has played a humanitarian role. Now, when we think about the Truth Commission, The Truth Commission is trying to do those dialogues that you are suggesting, Marianne, from a more sort of institutional level. So the 11 Truth Commissioners have created a team that has been working across the country and in 23 countries around the world, trying to take testimonies and to listen to the people who suffered that. So if in that interview where they can tell what happened with being questioned, probably they could find a path for forgiveness, for healing, for compassion, without being forced to do that, but just, for the first time, probably feel that they have been heard by someone who's got an institutional power and who is the state somehow saying, I believe what you are telling me. I'm not questioning your testimony. And the final thing, and with this, what I wrap up, then that's the reason why also the Peace Tribunal is so important. Because the Peace Tribunal, in the case of the FARC, for example, has taken 8 members of the Secretariat of the FARC and said, you, 8 people, name by name, are responsible for the taking of hostages. And you, because you were the leaders of that organization, are responsible for 19 offenses that fall within international crimes. And you cannot just walk back into political life without at least, receiving a sentence in which you, with a restorative justice framework, go and try to heal the social fabric that you destroyed of Colombian society. And it's exactly the same that is going to happen with the members of the army. It's not going to be just like we are going to send you to prison to get yourself rotten down there, but it's if you want to go back into civilian life, we're going to give you a special sentence, but that means that you go and restore the damage somehow that you caused to these people, to the mothers of those kids who were killed. Because we know that when you put someone into prison, that sometimes that person comes out worse than he was before. But when that person faces the victim, when that person has to rebuild the social fabric, there is a transformation that happens that is an example to society to be able to create a different future for the next generations.
Thank you. That's definitely, restorative justice has been at the heart of the work we've done with the Forgiveness Project. But I do completely take your point about not being able to move in a direction of healing without some sort of justice. Anyway, thank you very much. That's really inspiring.
Thank you, Marianne,
Yeah.
for your honesty and for telling your story. And I think that's brought out some really valuable things in this discussion.
I mean, I just think that's probably a good moment to finish, because it is a very powerful moment, and to think about these processes and leave us with, that sense that there are human processes there, and that they're in the kind of micro, and that the work that entails really for individuals, and and how that goes. And I think what Andrei has just told us is quite a kind of an interesting response to Marianne's story that I think is probably quite a good place to leave it. We've been here an hour and a quarter or whatever, so and it will certainly give me plenty to think about tonight. Yeah, are you okay with that, all of you out there? That feels just like a better point to okay. So I'd just like to really thank all of you for coming along and joining the conversation, but particularly to thank Andrei and Berit for giving us a much kind of wider and deeper understanding of what's going on. We're getting some applauses, and I'm sure people who can do that electronically. But to me, this is the kind of event that I love to do with WOW Festival. It's not just about the films; it's about all the issues and things that come out and allow us to really think deeply about how we live our lives, really. So it's really been an honor to be part of this event, really. So thank you. And hopefully you shall see some other films and come to some more of our Q&As. We've got one every night this week, so do keep joining in and keeping on the conversation. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, David. And thanks everyone for your brilliant questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for your questions and for the invitation.